Hi, this is Dan Heisman, and we're having another video here on YouTube to help you improve your chess skills. What are the best chess skills? Well, the big three, I think, are analysis, evaluation, and time management. What are those things if you don't know? Well, time management is how you manage your clock during a game. Chess is played with a clock. You're trying to do two things. One is you're trying to use up almost all your time every game, so you're doing the best you can, but without getting into unnecessary time trouble or playing too fast. You don't want to play too fast, you don't want to play too slow. That's macro time management. Micro time management is where you figure out how much time to spend on each move. You want to spend more time on complicated critical moves and less time on mundane moves that don't really mean that much. So learning what a complicated move is, not a complicated move, but what a critical move is important for your time management. Evaluation is when you reach a position, you try to figure out who stands better, how much better, and why do they stand better. So for instance, you might say something like, white is slightly better because he has a lead in development, or black has a big advantage because black has the bishop pair and white has a slightly wrecked pawn structure. Or white is winning, but not winning easily. He's up a pawn, he's got control of the file, he's got a good outpost for his knight, but there's still a lot of work to do. That's evaluation. The big chess skill is analysis. Analysis is where you're creating your tree of moves that you're going to be looking at. You look at your candidate moves, your opponent's candidate moves. You determine if they're safe. You try to reach quiescence, which is where there's no more checks, captures, or threats of any consequence. And then when you reach quiescence, you can evaluate the position. So those are the skills you're trying to develop. That's as opposed to your chess knowledge. Your chess knowledge is things like knowing certain opening sequences, knowing certain endgame sequences, knowing certain principles, recognizing certain patterns for tactics. Those are knowledge. My guess is that chess is about 2/3 of skills and about 1/3 of knowledge, but that's arguable. It's hard to measure exactly what that is, but if you try to gain more and more knowledge, let's say you study openings more and more and more, and now you know 6 moves of the Caro-Kann instead of 5 moves of the Caro-Kann, and the game goes 40 moves, well, in the last 34 moves of the game, after you learn your 6th move, you're still out of the book, and now you have to be yourself and not play at the book level. And if you're playing 5 moves or 6 moves at a 3500 level for equal to a best engine, and then the rest of the game you're playing at a 1200 level, well, the chain's only as strong as its weakest link, and you're pretty much going to be a 1200 player even if you study more openings. If you don't understand that concept, and you're just sitting there trying to gain more knowledge, well, knowledge is helpful, but it's not what's going to make you better. You want to be better at analysis. So let's take a look at a game. I picked out a random game from one of my old students' libraries here on the Internet Chess Club, and let's see what we can learn a little bit about the analysis and evaluation of some of the positions they reach. So let's see how many book moves these guys know. D4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight f3, bishop g7. All right, heading for some sort of King's Indian. If you're white and you don't know what to do here, an obvious idea would be to try to get your pawn up to e4 by playing knight c3. White plays knight c3. If black wants to play Grunfeld, that's knowledge. He can play d5, or if he's playing King's Indian, he can just castle. He doesn't have to play d6 yet because there's no pawn on e4 threatening to go to e5 and driving the knight out of the middle. All right, so black does castle, and white plays e3. All right, so e3, that's probably going to take most people out of their book. The book move would be to play e4. The main book line, here's my chess knowledge, is e4, d6, bishop e2, e5, and now my knowledge is that even though white is attacking the pawn twice and it's only guarded once, my knowledge is that you can't win that pawn. So my knowledge said the best move is castle, knight c6, d5, knight e7, and now we have the Tabiab, the mainline King's Indian. The hot line right these days is knight e1. Okay, so back to the game. In the game, white doesn't play e4. He only plays e3. Is that a bad move? No, but it takes you out of your book, and now you have to figure out, what do you want to do? Black's going to play for either a break with c5. It's not really a break because white could go past and get a Benoni structure. Or he can play it like a Grunfeld and play d5. Or he can play for e5 with d6 and then get some more pieces to support the e5 break. So That's what black wants to do, and he has to figure out how to do that. Now, I've given engines a lot of positions over the years where white plays e3 against king's Indians, and the engines generally want to play something like d6 followed by c5. Let's turn on the engine here. Again, this is knowledge, not analysis and evaluation. And we analyze the position. Stockfish says he wants to play it like a Grunfeld and play d5 right away. But if we force black to play d6 and white plays, let's say, bishop d3, now he's looking at trying to play rook e8 so he can play e5 and then later maybe even threaten e4. And he says you can even play e5 right away safely. Okay, so Stockfish is the one doing the analysis here. Let's go back to the game and see what we can learn. Okay, we'll make the board regular size here. So black does play d6 just like what he's set up now is called the King's Indian setup, where you play these 5 moves against white's moves. And if you do it against e4, we call that a Peart's defense. If you do it against d4, c4, we call it a King's Indian defense. If you do it against anything else, then we could just call it a King's Indian setup. Okay, white plays bishop d3. Black plays knight bd7. That's a common idea by beginners to play e5. It's not a bad idea, but a lot of times you don't need it to play e5. You can set it up without your knight on d7. Okay, let's see what white does. White castles. Black plays e5. He's not threatening e4 yet because there's 2 pieces on it, but if he gets his rook or his queen on it, he'll be able to do that. So white should be able to analyze that e4 is not a threat. Let's see what white does. He overprotects e4 anyway. Okay, what can black do here? Well, black can play c6. That's a common move. This is, again, knowledge. He could overprotect the e5 pawn with rook e8 with the idea of playing e4 maybe later. Those would be the 2 big moves here, rook e8 or c6. Black plays b6. All right, so my knowledge is that black almost never plays b6 in a King's Indian. White could just, for instance, close the center with d5, making the c7 pawn backward and blocking the bishop on the diagonal. There's other things that white could do. We're still at the edge of my knowledge here, even though I've probably never been in this position in my life, but I have an idea from my knowledge on what's going on here. So let's see what white decides to do. He takes the pawn. Usually you take back with the pawn to get space rather than taking with the knight. Taking with the knight is not terrible. He takes with the knight, forking the bishop and the knight. But now if white plays knight takes, after pawn takes, black's sitting pretty comfortably. Okay, so black probably wants to fianchetto the bishop here and finish his development. White plays knight e4. Here, if I'm black, I'm going to play bishop to b7. Now I'm completely in my analysis. Is white threatening anything? Well, knight takes f6 is not a threat. He can't go to c5. He can't go to d6. So black should just complete his development, play bishop to b7. And he does. Now, is black threatening anything? Knight takes e4, bishop takes e4, bishop takes e4, queen takes e4. Black then plays f5. White can just move the queen. So black's not threatening anything. But black's ready to expand. He's also ready to finish his development with something like queen e7 and then put his rooks on the central files. Let's see what white does. White plays rook d1. He's not really threatening anything. I guess because if he plays knight takes f6 check, black can play queen takes f6 to get the queen off the file. But it's a good idea to get your queen out of the way before he threatens anything. So here it's a good idea to play queen e7. All right, if we do that, then black's got a comfortable position. Black's bishops are a little better than white's bishops. White's bishop on c1 is blocked in. Now I'm doing evaluation. So we're evaluating the position as being okay for black. Black's probably overcome all his opening disadvantages. If I had to evaluate this position, I'd say black might even be better by a couple tenths of a pawn. Let's say Stockfish. What's the evaluation? Stockfish says, oh, that Dan just missed a tactic. Okay, I missed an overworked piece tactic because I wasn't paying too much attention. So there's my analysis skills failing me. After knight takes, if he plays bishop takes, then Black has bishop takes e4 hitting the queen, and the queen is overworked, hitting the rook and the queen. If rook takes queen, then bishop takes queen, and black wins material. So black's actually winning here if he counts right. By the way, I call this a counting tactic. You have to look at the different permutations, because after knight takes, bishop takes, black has several things he could do. He could guard the bishop with the queen, like queen c8 or queen b8. He could move the queen out of the way, but then he loses the bishop. He could play bishop takes e4. He could play queen takes d1 check. So we have to look at all the different sequences. And the right sequence is knight takes e4, bishop takes e4, bishop takes e4. Black's up a piece and he's hitting the queen. If rook d8, bishop takes c2. And when the smoke clears there, we have quiescence in another move or two. So knight takes, bishop takes, rook takes, bishop takes. And now if he takes a rook, it doesn't matter whether he moves back or he takes. Let's say he takes, king takes, and black is up a bishop. Okay, so let's go back through those moves again. That's why you take your time when you're analyzing. Here I am talking and not paying much attention to what's going on in the game, and already white has blundered. White thinks he's got a discovered attack, but actually he's giving black an overworked piece tactic. Why is it an overworked piece? Because after bishop takes, white can't simultaneously guard the rook and take the bishop. So he can't just take the bishop, but if he takes the queen first, then when black takes the queen, both rooks are guarding each other. So the best white can do is just, let's say, if he goes back, then black will save the bishop and black's up a piece. Let's see if black's found this tactic in the game. Black plays queen e7, so he misses the basic tactic. So unfortunately, in a slow game, this is a 25-5 game, so we would hope black's rated 1421, which is maybe his USCF rating, maybe his ICC standard rating. So this is not beyond his capability. You have to go through those checks, captures, and threats. And as I said, you have to start by looking at the forcing lines. Well, bishop takes is a forcing move. Knight takes is a forcing move. Bishop takes doesn't work, of course, because after bishop takes, white's threatening the rook, and he's threatening the queen. So we don't have time to take the bishop now because the knight wouldn't be threatening the queen. So that would be the wrong sequence. So black gets his queen out of the way. All right. So black misses a chance to win a piece here. And he plays queen e7. All right, black has a pretty good game. Let's see what the evaluation is now. I thought he was ahead a little bit. We saw he was, of course, winning. Now the evaluation is, pretty close to 0, 0, 0. Stockfish has it right about 0. It says white should develop the bishop with bishop d2. Okay, so knight takes f6. So now you have a choice of taking with the bishop or the knight. This is the kind of move you don't want to play fast. These moves are usually at least somewhat critical. Taking with the queen looks reasonable. Gets the queen off the e file, attacking on the f file. Taking with the bishop and getting out of the fianchettoed area. Not terrible, but not probably the best. So probably here it's not too critical, but I would take with the queen. Okay. And white plays bishop e4. But now his bishop on c1 isn't really developed very well. So black has a pleasant choice. He can play bishop takes, queen takes, rook f d8 and get ahead in development. Or he could play something like, what would be an alternative here? He doesn't want to guard the bishop. That would be wrong. He can't move the bishop because the bishop takes a8. So I guess bishop takes followed by moving a rook to the d file is correct. So now we're doing analysis. Clearly black doesn't have any tactics here. The only capture he has of any consequence is bishop takes e4. And that's probably the safest way to save the bishop. I know a lot of people, I go over their games and they have a way to save the bishop and they think, oh, I'm going to show everybody how smart I am. I'm going to counterattack. Well, showing everybody how smart you are by not playing the obvious simple moves is usually not a great thing in chess. Yes, occasionally grandmasters win games through very clever moves that they show you in videos and in books, but a lot of times the best move is the simplest move, sort of an Occam's razor kind of thing. All right, so if black doesn't play bishop takes e4 here, I'm going to be very surprised. My analysis tells me that's the best move. And he just guards it with bishop c6. Okay, let's ask Stockfish what was the best move there. Stockfish, what's number one? Whoops. Yeah, bishop takes e4. You know, playing bishop c6 isn't terrible, but you're just making things a little more complicated than you have to. When you play a move like bishop c6, it ties down your queen to guarding the bishop. All right, so white plays bishop d2. Makes sense to try to develop his pieces. Now when black plays rook fd8 or rook ad8, probably rook ad8, when the bishop goes to c3, the rook will be guarded. So black basically lost the tempo here, and that enabled white to catch up. So now white's doing fine. Rook ad8, I think that's the best move. White should now play bishop to c3. And he does. Well, black can't trade rooks and then play rook d8 because his queen would be overworked. If rook takes d1, rook takes d1, rook d8, then white would just play rook takes d8, queen takes d8, bishop takes c6, winning a piece. So black cannot trade off and neutralize the file. That's my analysis skills at work. White has a little bit of pressure on the e5 pawn. If black doesn't do anything, white might be able to play a move like f4, and the pawn on e5 is pinned to the queen on f6. Then in that case, the queen would be a little overworked because the queen would need to guard the bishop on c6 and help the bishop on g7 guard the pawn on e5. So white probably has a minor threat now to play f4 in some lines. Probably the easiest way to get out of that is to play bishop takes e4 when the queen doesn't have to worry about guarding the bishop on c6. What else could black play? Black could just guard the pawn with rook on f to e8. So now we're doing analysis. We're picking up candidate moves. Candidate moves being things like queen e6, bishop e4, rook f e8. Those are all moves worth considering. What else could black try? He could play a5 to get a little space on the queen side. He could play h5 to get a little space on the king side. Those aren't terrible moves, probably, assuming that f4 doesn't win anything. We'd have to analyze that, but let's see what black did. Black played queen e6 to get out of that pin. Okay, so now if white plays f4, black can just play e takes f4 and get a discovered attack on the bishop. So f4 is not a good move now. So white could trade rooks and then trade bishops and then play rook d1. He can't trade rooks and play rook d1 because then his queen is overworked. So rook takes d8, rook takes d8, rook d1 would lose to rook takes d1, check, queen takes d1, bishop takes e4. For those of you that can't follow those analysis, we'll move the pieces. Rook takes, rook d1 question mark. Rook takes, queen has to take, bishop takes e4. Overworked queen on c2. Okay, sometimes people say to me, Dan, why don't you draw lines when you're doing this so I can follow you? Well, okay, but you want to learn how to visualize, and you can always pause the video. You can always get out of board and move the pieces. So I shouldn't have to move the pieces, and in fact, if you want to develop your visualization skills and you want to be able to move the pieces around in your head, it's a good idea to try to follow the analysis either through in your head, or if it's too fast, maybe pause the video and then try to follow it. But, you don't want to have me, show you every time exactly what I'm looking at if I'm telling you, because you have to develop that skill, because if you're going to be a good analyst, then you can't say, well, I can't visualize, so I can't analyze. The answer is, well, yeah, work on your visualization skills so you can become a better analyst, because knowing where I move the pieces is not as important as developing your analytical skills so that you can do the same kind of analysis also. The other thing that queen e6 does is it threatens to take this pawn because it would attack the bishop twice, and if let's say white does nothing, then queen takes here, and black can't play bishop takes e5 because white would trade queens and the pawn on e5 is guarded. But if he plays bishop takes first, queen takes, he still can't move the bishop anywhere because the queen's pinned. So queen takes c4 is a threat. White should probably meet that threat with a move like b3. All right, let's see what white does. He plays b3. All right, so the game's pretty even. If black wants to expand here, he can play f5. He doesn't have to worry about bishop d5 pinning the queen to the king because bishop takes d5 would win a pawn. If f5 and bishop takes c6, then after queen takes c6, black's doing fine. He's got a little more space in the center, so f5 is a good move here. Let's see what he did. He played rook up to double. Usually when they double, you like to take before he doubles, so he can't double on the file. But again, white can't play, well, he can play rook takes here, because if queen takes, he still can't play rook d1, because the bishop takes e4, rook takes d7, bishop c2, winning a piece just like the one before that Stockfish had pointed out to me. So white's got to be a little bit careful here with the counting sequence. He can play bishop takes first. That's probably the right way to do it. He should play bishop takes, queen takes, rook takes d7, queen takes c7, rook d1, and get the file. So that looks like the right sequence for white. White should play bishop takes c6, queen takes c6, rook takes d7, queen takes d7, rook d1, with a slight advantage. He plays rook takes first. Okay, now black has a choice of bishop takes e4 hitting the queen, so that on queen takes he can play queen takes d7 and white can't put the rook on the d file. Or he could set that trap, take with the queen, and if rook to d1, then bishop takes e4 wins. He takes with the queen, and now white cannot play rook d1. Black will play bishop takes e4, winning a piece just as before. So what should white do? He should play bishop takes c6, queen takes c6, and rook d1. These are my basic analytical skills here. So rook d1, bishop takes e4 would be a counting sequence with an overworked queen. Let's see if white fell for that trap. No, he didn't. Bishop takes c6, good for white. Queen takes. Now he can play rook d1, and black can't play rook d8, and white's doing fine. So he plays rook d1. Okay, black needs to get his rook into the game. Ideally, he'd love to play rook d8, but he can't do that right now. So he has to come up with another idea. There's lots of things he could do. He could still play f5 if he wants to. He could bring the queen over to guard the rook, but there's not a lot of good ways to do that right at the moment. Let's see what he does. He plays rook e8. Now white should put both of his pieces on the d file. Play something like queen to d3, or he could create luft, the opposite color of the bishop. He could play g3 and create luft on the back rank here. So my top candidate moves would be g3 or queen d3. Queen d2 isn't bad, but I like queen d3 a little better. Rook d5. Well, he's not really going to attack this pawn. Black's got it guarded twice, and if worst comes to worst, you can always guard it with a pawn. But I guess he wants to double his pieces with the rook in front. So as we said, white has the file. White's a little better. Black does guard the pawn. White doubles on the d file. Now white's better. He's threatening to get the rook to the 7th rank. Black plays a5, just kind of waiting. There goes the rook to the 7th rank. Now black would almost like to play rook f8 and rook f7, and if rook checks, then just bring the rook back to f8 again. White can trade queens, of course, anytime he wants. Black brings the bishop back. Not sure where he's going. Maybe he's going to d6 to block the rook out. That's probably what he's doing. All right, so if white wants to, he could trade off the queens. He does. All right, black only has 2 moves that don't lose the queen. Queen e6 and queen takes d5. He may as well play queen takes d5. Let's see what he plays. He does. If white takes with the pawn, it's not isolated. And then his rook is threatening to take on c7. Black could guard it with bishop d6, but white has a much better endgame. White takes it with the rook. Not sure about that. Now white could march his king over to the black to march his king over to the center and play rook to d8. Let's see what he does. He plays bishop d6, blocking out the rook. All right, pretty even position. I think if I were white, I would have taken with the pawn. When you have those kind of moves, whether you take with the rook or the pawn, it's fairly critical. We don't have the time management. But you want to play those moves very carefully because it could make a big difference in the game. All right, so the bishop blocks out the rook. h3, that's the wrong color if you're trying to make luft, because black can still... So now, black, his king is worth 4.25. If he gets it in the middle, bring the king up. Good move. Good move for white. Good move. Okay, fairly equal endgame. Bye-bye, Mr. Rook. He goes back. Rook there, getting better, ready to play a5, a4. It's not really a break because white can go past it with b4. He could play c5 first and then play a4, but if he plays c5, that puts all his pawns on dark color. And then after a4, black has a very, very bad bishop, so I don't think he should play c5 here anytime soon. There's that a4 move. Okay, well, c5 is definitely not the right move to play here. If black wants to trade rooks, he can always play rook a7 and rook d7 and then move the bishop. He plays there, getting ready to break with b5. e4, h5. You want your, for the most part, you want your pawns in these kind of positions on the opposite color of your bishop. So the bishop has scope and the opposing pawns are blocked on the same color so you can attack them. There are exceptions to that. Of course, now black changes his mind and decides he wants to break with f5. And he decides not to break. White attacks the g-pawn. Black guards it. At this point, if they wanted to agree to a draw, they could. Black says, I don't want to draw, let me break. White goes back. Can we win this pawn? It doesn't look like it because if we take it, he can attack it with the king and then, or even attack with the rook and then attack it again. You could take the pawn though, it's not terrible. He pushes past. All right, well now the rook's definitely going to go to d3. If he goes to g5, then bishop e7 traps the rook. Good move by white. g5. Black has his pawns on the same color as his bishop, but at least they're coming down the board now, and they're not really blocking the bishop at the moment. g3. Another pawn on the dark color. I don't know about that. If I'm white here, I might block off the king side and use these pawns as targets in the endgame. He plays king up. Black should probably just open that line and check him. Plays bishop back. King up. He's got to be careful here. If that rook can give a check, there could be a mating pattern. Probably not. Rook back. King up. Bishop up, bishop back, bishop c5. That's why he didn't play c5. The bishop's not a bad bishop without that pawn on c5. Rook back, putting his rook and his bishop on dark squares. That looks a little questionable. I would definitely play pawn takes, rook check here and get my rook in the game. He plays bishop d4, blocking off the d file. If I were white, I think I'd play g4 and just block the king side with a draw. Pawn takes, pawn takes, pawn takes, king takes. Bishop skewers, the rook should guard the bishop. Bishop checks. Now if bishop takes bishop, black can penetrate a little bit. So he just brings his king up. We could play rook h8, threatening rook h4, king f3, rook takes f3 check. And he does. Bishop there, threatening, counter-threatening rook d6. I don't think that works. Rook checks, king here. Rook checks looks good for black. Rook checks, king f3. Rook checks, king there. Well, if worse comes to worse, I can play rook takes b2 and just hit the bishop. Rook h2. King f3. Well, now I could block the rook so he can't come in and trade off into a bishops of the same color endgame up a pawn. He checks. Checks, and he plays c5, stopping the rook from coming in. Okay, well, definitely black is better here. Bishop there. If bishop takes bishop, then king takes rook. I'm not sure why he pushed the pawn. Why doesn't he just take the pawn on b3? That doesn't make any sense. Maybe he's getting into time trouble. We don't have the time stamping. He's still not taking that pawn on b3. Now he's threatening the pawn on b3. Now the bishop is hanging. All right, well, bishop takes bishop, and if rook takes, bishop checks, holds the rook. So bishop takes bishop wins a piece. Maybe white's in time trouble too. Oh, he misses it. Bishop takes. There's no checks. If he takes the rook, you take his rook. If he attacks the bishop, you guard the rook with the bishop. So this looks like time trouble. Bishop there. Rook takes the pawn. He's up 2 pawns. Check, winning the bishop, and white resigns. Okay, so we were using a lot of analytical skills. I think both sides got in a little time trouble there at the end. Black did not want to give a draw, and he managed to win. Okay, so using your analytical skills to get to be a better player, that's the kind of thing that'll make you better. How much of this game was knowledge? How much of this game was skill? Well, you saw me use my knowledge in the first 7 or 8 or 9 moves, but then after that it turned to more and more skill. If you enjoyed today's video, please tell your friends about my channel, Dan Heisman Chess, here on YouTube. You can hit the like button or the subscribe button. We thank you very much. We'll see you next time. Bye.